if you're catching us this week for the first time, we are in a series called Unmasked. We're looking at what it's like and the amazing things that can happen when we come face to face with the grace and the mercy of Jesus. And I'd like to invite you, if you have the opportunity, to look at a passage with me. I'll read it in a moment, but you can also find it in the Bible that's provided for you in front of you, and I think it's page 1685, 86, right around there. And this is a story after Easter, okay? The resurrection has already happened. Easter has already occurred, and so you got to kind of set your watches ahead 3 weeks from now. It's the week after Easter when this story is primarily told, and this is a story of Jesus coming to a guy who's usually called Doubting Thomas. And so let's hear what this has to say to us. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, which means the twin, was one of the 12 and was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were, put my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week later, the disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand, put it in my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you've seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." You know, as a sophomore in college, I got to know Malcolm, and Malcolm was a fascinating upperclassman. He was obviously from kind of old money, and his father was a big financial advisor and all that sort of thing, and you could tell because he did have clothes that were bought for him by his mom or dad, and they were the kind of preppy clothes that all of us aspired to wear at that time, and we didn't have them. But they were always a little baggy on Malcolm. He had the weird habit of wearing this green felt hat and a very sincere face that kind of made him look like Kermit the Frog. But he was a Christian and a really interesting guy. He wanted to be a doctor. He was convinced that that was what God wanted him to do, but he didn't have very good study habits. And so he would walk around, and in the right pocket of his very baggy chinos, he always had a bottle of caffeine pills. And he would talk with you and just get so deep into this conversation with you about philosophy or politics or faith or anything else. And then he'd say, "It's 2 a.m, I gotta go write a paper for tomorrow." And he'd pull out a pop a thing and then just go off and write his. This was Malcolm. He was an upperclassman. I really admired him. And so one day when he said to me, "Bryan, I want to start a Bible study. Would you come?" I said, "Sure, okay." "What's the topic?" He says, "I want to start a Bible study for people who don't believe the Bible is true." Okay. And so he advertised it all over campus. The first one was called "Opiate of the Masses?" which is a quote from Karl Marx about the Christian church. He thought it was just a drug for all the people. And we had all these different things that would try and be provocative, and every semester, 2 different times, we had maybe 12, 14 people come to our dorm room space and sit down with us and argue about the Bible. Skeptics of all sorts. I mean, there were agnostics and atheists, and we talked Hinduism and Marxism and deconstructionism, which means this table and this right here doesn't exist. It's just a figment of your imagination and mine. We're in a shared illusion. There's nothing that's really solid and true. How can you prove it? Go ahead, try. You know, that sort of thing. And just all these different philosophies and everything. There was actually one philosophy called Eck, which was strange for me. My last name is Eckelmann, because they would advertise on campus, Eck is, And Malcolm always thought that was hilarious. And he said, there you are, Bryan. But anyway, all these different strange things. And this was new for me because the Bible studies and the church events that I'd gone to, I'd grown up in church. And what I always kind of gleaned from what was going on around me, it was never spoken, but it was really the message that I had, which was simply this: doubts should be ignored or suppressed, but never really talked about. If you got doubts about the Bible, just keep it to yourself. That's not a Christian thing to do, is to question. You ever thought that's kind of what a Christian should behave like, what a churchgoer should act like? Anyway, in this Bible study, I learned two things. Number one, there's a lot more skeptics, both inside and outside churches, than most of us realize. And number two, inside every person of faith, there's a little bit of skeptic in all of us. Going back to the story we just read, there's a little bit of Thomas in you, and there's a little bit of Thomas in me. Somebody who wants the info, wants the skinny, wants to be absolutely certain, and knows deep down, I'm not quite positive about something. But in a way, that's the nature of faith. We'll get to that in a second. Thomas wants proof. Maybe you do too. And the story, today's message, is going to speak to skeptics. The skeptics that are here in the room and the skeptic inside of all of us that's either whispering or shouting to your mind right now. Two early lessons in the passage. If you have a chance, open up your Bibles. Otherwise, just remember what we just read. The first message that I think comes clear is, of course, this one: don't miss church. Yeah, I think that's the message. Have a look for a second. Now, Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. When did Jesus arrive? When did he rise from the dead? Easter Sunday, right? And Thomas wasn't there. He didn't show up. They all gathered in a house, and Thomas wasn't there. Maybe he had a family commitment. Maybe he had some business he had to attend to. Maybe he had a sporting match he had to go to, or he wanted to catch it on the podcast later on. I don't know what it was. Maybe he overslept. What it was that kept him away, but he missed church that day. And Jesus showed up, and he missed out. A week later, guess what day? Sunday. Thomas, it actually says 7 days later in the actual translation. A week later, on Sunday, they're also in the house again. This time, Thomas is there, and guess what? Jesus shows up. Message, I think the writer of this gospel is kind of winking at us and saying, by the way, folks, don't miss church. Come on Sunday, get to worship, gather with other people of faith, gather with people even if you have your doubts, because you know what? This is where Jesus shows up. He might show up in your life elsewhere, but he really shows up here. When people gather, that's the time. Don't miss out. Thomas missed out the first time. It almost wrecked him. He remedied the cause. Jesus showed up. The second thing that I think it says right from the beginning, Jesus honors sincere doubt. When Jesus arrives, he comes right to them, stands among them, and says, "Peace be with you." In verse 27, he says, then he says to Thomas, "Put your finger here. Take a look." Jesus knew somehow Thomas had these doubts. And when he arrives, he doesn't simply ignore Thomas, give him the silent treatment. He doesn't just deal with all the people who believe. He actually goes straight to Thomas and say, "You want proof? Here you go. Go ahead. Not only look, feel free. And by the way, put your hand in my side. Let me ask you a question." Jesus is wearing what you would guess is a toga. How do you get to that? He actually lifts that up if need be. Jesus is so willing to hear your doubts and to respond to them. This is a passage where Jesus gives skeptics time, space, and respect. And it's pretty important. Because after all, if Jesus of Nazareth did not die and then rise again, if there is a tomb in Palestine that's still full of his body, then Christianity is busted. And what we're doing here, as wonderful and well organized as you think it might be, as joyous for our hearts as it might be, it's really kind of for loss. And so Thomas wanted proof. And he had Jesus' hands and feet inside as his proof. What do we have today? What do we have? Now, whole books have been written about this, but very briefly, what I'd like to do with the next 7 or so minutes is offer you hands, feet, and side. 3 different things that you and I have that I would call Easter evidence. So that as you approach Easter 2 weeks from today, as you prepare your heart and your mind and your life for that experience of celebrating the risen Lord, you can have an honesty and a sincerity in your belief, in your faith, that this really happened, that it was a historical event. And the 3 different things go like this. If it were his hands and the nail pierces there, I think the first thing would be, of course, the empty tomb. History records that the tomb was empty, and you say, yeah, but it's only the people who wrote this. Well, let's talk about that. Because without Christianity, without the resurrection, Christianity could never have begun. The resurrection changes everything. Remember that Christianity is not wisdom to make us smarter, not ethics to make us better. It is a person who is alive to make us holy. And that's totally different. It has to hinge on the resurrection. First of all, take notice. Yes, the disciples said, there's no body. But guess what? So did the Romans, so did the Jewish leadership, everyone who wanted to see Christianity stop. And by the way, this wasn't the first time somebody said, I'm the Messiah, I'm here to save God's people. But every other person previous and afterwards died and filled a tomb. If the Romans or the Jewish leadership or anyone else wanted to just call Christianity a hoax right from the beginning and discredit everything that Jesus' followers would be saying after Easter morning, all they had to do was produce a body, and they didn't. The second thing is what we call the ring of truth. Just has that ring, that it's true. These are the eyewitness testimonies that we have in the Bible. And they just sound so different than anything else. Every other time you hear about somebody who miraculously kind of comes back to life, they're always glowing. They're always kind of like a ghost or something. They always have supernatural power. Jesus is absolutely human. It's really amazing. I mean, yes, he walks into a locked room, but otherwise you see hands, feet. He has a body. And we can't get into Platonism and all that sort of thing that lets you know that that sort of thing just wasn't supposed to happen with people who had died and were somehow eternal. But Jesus was that way. And people like Thomas proclaimed that they saw Jesus. In 1 Corinthians 15, the Apostle Paul, about 20 years after the original Easter, writes this to the believers in Corinth. This is a public document that he writes to people who live just about an hour outside of Athens, Greece. And he says, "For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ, that is Jesus, died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep." 20 years after Easter, Paul says, I want you to know, number one, he was dead. Roman soldiers didn't mess around. They were absolutely clear on what was a dead body and what was a living body, almost dead. Jesus died, and his body was in the tomb for 3 days, and then the tomb was empty, and people saw him. And Paul is actually saying this, but he actually goes on to say in a public document to people 20 years after the event, he says, by the way, if you don't believe it, if you'd like more proof, go talk to Jane over here. Go talk to Joe. Go talk to any number of the nearly 500 people. Some of them have already died, but the rest are still around. They're alive and kicking. You can ask them. They saw him. It's amazing. It's the kind of eyewitness testimony you just can't imagine. Not only that, and I just find this fascinating, this was in a culture where, and hold with me for a second, where in that sinful culture, women were so low on the social status that their testimony was not even allowed in courtrooms. They didn't have the education or the brain power or whatever it was. They weren't considered reliable witnesses to anything by that society. And yet, who are the very first people that the gospel writers tell us saw Jesus resurrected? Women. It's an absolutely amazing thing, because think of this with me for a moment. If you were the type of person who was deciding to write down something that would spin out this new thing called Christianity based on the idea that Jesus is alive, and you could write your own, you could alter the story however you wanted, would you put women as the first people to see Jesus? Not in that time, you wouldn't. The only reason that would happen, the only reason they would be written into the story is if they really were the first people. That's what I mean by the ring of truth. It just doesn't make sense unless it's true. But the third thing, if you go from hands to feet, and this is the side. This is, to me, the crucial issue that lets me know it is the most persuasive thing I have. Because it's the thing that everybody has to agree on, whether they are historians of any strain of faith, is that the day before Easter, Jesus' followers were a group of people who were misfits, has-been, crooks, running for their lives, hiding in fear and confusion, paralyzed by guilt and shame, and arguing with one another as to who's going to be better than the other, who's going to have the higher status. They have no moral authority, they have no courage, they have no ability to form a movement, and yet, a few days later, something happens that makes them so galvanized, so convinced, that they form the greatest movement our culture has ever seen. What was it about these group of people? What explains their confidence, their fearlessness in sharing the gospel so gladly, even at the cost of their own lives? Thomas, along with 11 of the 12 disciples, went to their death saying that Jesus was alive, eternal, and there was a job to be done. Only John died in exile. Every other one was put to death in a gruesome way and was given an out. Simply say Jesus is a human being who's filling a tomb somewhere in Palestine. No, I will not. And you know what? Throughout history, this saying has been true. Nobody will willingly die for what they know to be a hoax. And therefore, every historian has to grant the fact that the followers of Jesus in the first century absolutely believed that he was alive, that they had seen him, and that he was Lord and God. That's the Easter evidence. And for you and me, I think that's amazing. One other thing at the very end of this passage, because we need to understand how we work on our doubt and our faith. Because when I look at what Jesus says to Thomas and to skeptics like you and me, and to the skeptical side of each one of us, I'm a little confused. At least I was at first. Have a look at the scriptures. Jesus honors Thomas's doubt at first by saying, put your fingers here, see my hands, reach out your hand and put it in my side. He honors Thomas's doubts. But then a moment later, he seems to rebuke Thomas for doubting. Stop doubting and believe, he says. Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and have yet believed. So what does Jesus want us to do with our skepticism? A couple of things we need to remember. Number one, all of us act on faith. Faith is not something that's mystical, that's out there, that you have to feel, that Tinkerbell sprinkles some stuff on you and then you have faith. That's not how it works. All of us have faith. Faith is simply a measure of confidence that causes us to act. And every single one of you has faith. I know that because all of you are sitting down. You actually looked at the pew that you were about to sit in, the chair that you were about to sit in, and you just assumed that it would hold your weight. As far as I know, none of you actually looked underneath to see if it was solid enough for you. You just sat down. That's faith. Did you think for a moment that you might fall over, that it might not be sturdy enough for you? It's possible, but you still acted, right? That's faith. We do that sort of thing all the time. Think about it. We ride on planes without meeting the pilots or examining the engines. We put money into banks without vetting the bank's insurance or confirming the honesty of the employees. All these are acts of faith. And here's the granddaddy of them all. We fall in love with and sometimes marry people we don't completely know or fully understand. Right? Feel free to give a loving look to the person next to you if you have that option. And say, yeah, I still don't know you completely. But I choose to stay with you. It's a scary little ride. Still remember as a high school pastor for a time, he might have been in college, but one of the students came up to me and says, Pastor Bryan, I really want you to pray for the woman I'm going to marry someday. I said, great, have I met her? She said, no, I haven't met her either. But I'm waiting for someone and I want you to pray. And well, what are you looking for? Kind of show, give me a list. Let me know. And he says, oh, Pastor Bryan, I just want someone, when I know her completely and know her heart, and I know everything about her, then I will ask her to marry me. And I thought to myself, oh, Lord, I'm looking at a lifetime bachelor. I mean, there's just no way that that's the way it works. The sheer tonnage of what I did not know about my wife before she asked me to marry her. Well, I asked her. But anyway, in that moment, that's faith. And by the way, in that moment, it's the type of faith that if you don't choose it, you lose. You lose joy, you lose opportunity, you lose any number of things. Don't leap blindly. Faith is not a blind leap into the darkness. Faith is a leap, but it's a leap based on evidence. You had evidence that that chair would hold you. It looked like it was wooden, and it looked like it was sturdy, and maybe you'd been in it before, so you had no problem with it. We make those kinds of decisions all the time, but when it comes to a relationship, it's even more important because faith is a leap, but it isn't blind ignorance. Faith, by definition, embraces some uncertainty, but it's based on the facts available. Don't mystify it too much and think I have to feel a certain way. And so like falling in love and trusting your life to another person, trusting your life to Jesus, yes, it comes with some faith, but only by faith can you allow the relationship to really change your soul and give you joy. It takes that kind of surrender. And until then, you will grip your doubts like this and never be able to open your hands to receive. Thomas had doubts, but then he had faith. Someone in a journal a while back, deciding I wanted to put this on the screen for you, wrote this: I feel like I'm on the edge of a cliff in my life, and where I would like to go is a small but terrifying leap over a deep chasm. If I leave, if I trust, I do not know for sure what will happen, but what I do know is this: if I don't leap, if I don't trust, if I don't hope, if I don't ask, I will never move, I will never know. I will live and grow old and die standing on this side of this cliff. And that's a tragedy. So here's what I think Jesus is saying to Thomas and to you and me. He honors Thomas's doubts and then he rebukes them. What he's saying is, you know what? Discover your doubts. Examine them. Figure them out. Put them to the test. But don't, for heaven's sake, don't cherish your doubts. Don't hold on to them so long that you never allow yourself to open your hands. Challenge your doubts. Put your doubts and your skepticism to the test. Look for evidence. Pray for wisdom. And then when you have examined and tested what you have yet to trust, fall on your knees and, like Thomas, confess the faith that God offers you in that moment that God has shown you. That's faith in one who gives you evidence. Thomas saw the risen Christ. He had an encounter with the unmasked God of the universe in human form. It was proven to Thomas by Jesus' physical death of his body and his resurrection, not his resuscitation. Let's get those two clear. Resuscitation means I come back to life like paddles on my chest, and then I die later on. Resurrection is coming back to life, to eternal life, never to die again. Jesus' body is still in the same shape it was that first Easter and that week after when Thomas was there and Jesus showed up in worship. And they came face to face to one another. And that changes everything. And the result was, without question, the greatest confession ever written in Scripture. Thomas says, "My Lord and my God." Is he doubting? Not anymore.